Okay, Sean, what are you going to do with this funny looking log? Well, stick around and let's see if we can take a bunch of scraps and make some art out of it. Today we're working on a segmented walnut salad bowl. Before we got over here to the table saw, we started at the drafting table. I found when working on segmented pieces, it's a lot easier to go in with a plan so that you know what kind of materials you need before you get started. Once I've got my drawing, I can create a pretty accurate cut list, and that's what I'm working on here. Planning these projects is really important, but you don't have to draw this out like I did. There are a couple of software packages that are available online. I'll put links in the descriptions to those below in case that would be helpful for you. So the one unique thing about this project is we're really making this all out of scraps. So I actually bought this wood, but these all came out of a cutoff bin for a local hardwood distributor. And I was able to buy all this walnut and a little bit of maple literally by the pound. So these are actual cutoffs that came out of their operations. Here what I'm doing is taking a thin strip of maple. So I want to create a 1/4 inch thick maple bead just as a decorative item at the top near the rim of the bowl. So here what I'm doing on the segment is I'm actually going ahead and gluing the walnut and the maple together just to make it a little bit easier instead of having a thin segmented ring. And depending on how you look at it, one of the downsides of using scrap is it takes a little bit more effort to kind of get everything surfaced and consistent. So in some cases you need to make things thinner, and other times you need to make them thicker. Now with the glue dry, let's get that walnut and maple piece down close to our final thickness. Now let's just clean up some of the bandsaw marks. Now it's time to start working on the first ring or the first layer for our blank. This is going to be the base, and we're going to start out with a block that's basically 8 inches by 8 inches and 3/4 of an inch thick. With all of our materials finally at the right widths and right thicknesses, it's time to start cutting our segments. For this bowl, each of the rings is going to have 12 different segments, so we're cutting these angles at 15 degrees. You can see this table saw sled that I have here is really specific to this task. Through trial and error, I've got the fence on this dialed in right at that 15-degree mark. That'll allow me when we're going to glue the rings together to be able to glue the whole ring together all at one time, all the way around. I also have a positive stop. You can see that little pin there near where my left hand is, and that allows me to get right back to the same exact location every time I want to use it. On the right hand side of the blade, I've got a stop that I can set to the precise dimension I want each segment to be. So then I can cut each of them identically, and then I've got a little toggle or hold down clamp that holds down the little cutoff piece as we're cutting through the saw. So this specialty crosscut sled makes pretty quick, accurate work of cutting all these segments. Before we glue our rings together, it's important to take each of the segments and just kind of sand off the little tear out pieces, or the fuzzies some people call them. While this is tedious, it is important to getting nice tight joints. You also want to be careful sanding because you don't want to change the angle on the segments. Our next step is to start gluing together the rings. We're going to apply glue to each end of the segment, basically every other one, and just kind of using a slight rubbing motion to get the segments to kind of start tacking up together before we get the large hose clamp around the whole assembly. So in this case, I'm basically taken a couple of hose clamps you'd buy at the hardware store. I've got the largest ones I could get. They're probably 6 or 8 inches, and I string 2 or 3 of them together to get the diameter that I want here for this ring. All in all, we've got 7 different rings here that we're going to assemble plus the base. So we're going to have 8 different layers as we create the blank for this bowl. Here's a quick shot of the rings all glued together and just drying. With the glue dry on the base, we're over at the bandsaw just to cut out an 8-inch rough circle. This will just make it a lot easier when we take this piece over to the lathe and get it ready for the rest of the glue up. With the base round, we've got it mounted here on our coal jaws, and all we're wanting to do is smooth this surface, kind of get rid of the glue lines and just kind of get a nice flat surface all the way across this one face. With the surface flattened, now I want to work on the foot of the bowl. So I've marked out 2 different diameters of circles here. I've got an outside diameter for the foot and an inside diameter. On the inside diameter, we're going to create a mortise or a recess. That's going to allow us to hold this bowl in expansion mode using our 4-jaw chuck when we kind of get the whole blank kind of glued together and mounted back on the lathe. Now oftentimes I use a tenon for this operation, but on this bowl, because I want to be able to produce several of these or many of these bowls more or less identically, I want to make it as efficient as possible. So in this case, using the recess, what I'm hoping to be able to do is avoid needing to reverse mount the bowl and then come back and address and create the foot at the very end of the process. With the foot complete and our mortise established, we've got the base flipped around back on the 4-jaw chuck. From here, all we want to do is flatten the surface. This is going to be the inside of the bowl. So all we're trying to do here is create a nice flat foundation for the rest of the rings to be glued onto. I know sanding's boring, and I forgot to actually film flattening the rings, but here is my setup. I used a big shop-made sanding disc mounted in the lathe, and that's what I used to flatten each of the rings. So you'll just have to trust that I actually got all these rings flattened. So now it's time to start assembling the rings. And so what I'm trying to do here is mark or get them as centered as possible. For the sake of time, I want to try to glue all of these layers all at one time, more or less. It's important to have the rings as centered as possible so that when we go to start turning, we don't run out of material or have really thick spots or really thin spots. Then once I've got the ring in position where I want it, I'm just going to mark it so I can return it to the spot and make sure it doesn't shift. Now we're ready to start gluing things together. So if you've ever glued 2 pieces of wood together, you know as soon as you apply the wood glue to those surfaces, everything wants to slip and move around. So before I add wood glue, what I'm doing here is just putting a little dab of hot glue right along those lines I marked out earlier as we're trying to get the alignment right. The little dots of hot glue will prevent the rings from sliding too far out of alignment once we add the wood glue. Then it's just kind of a rinse and repeat process until we've got all the rings glued together. I didn't really talk about this contraption that we're gluing all this stuff up with, and it's really just kind of a shop-made press. It's a couple layers of plywood, some all-thread rod, some nuts and washers, but it's a pretty simple jig I put together several years ago, but it works great for these types of operations. Now we're ready for my favorite part, which is the turning. So I'm starting here with my 1/2-inch bowl gouge, and all I'm doing is we're starting to work on the shape of the outside of the bowl. My first step here is just to kind of work down the little steps or the increments that the segments that the rings create. One thing you might notice here is the chuck jaws. So I'm using Nova's long nose chuck jaws, and that's very intentional for this bowl. Because we're using the recess as intended, what that long nose chuck allows is it pushes the bottom of the bowl quite a ways from the chuck. So even as we're working on the exterior of the bowl, I can still get all the way down to the foot of the bowl with my tools. So this setup is really going to help us avoid having to reverse mount this this bowl and kind of finish the bottom later as we intended, or as we discussed previously when we were creating the foot on the bottom of the base. And if you recall, the hot glue we used just to kind of keep everything in place when we were doing our glue up, the hot glue just turns away really easily here in this step. Here's a good shot of how that long nose chuck jaw really helps us get all the way down into the bottom of the bowl. To help refine the exterior of the bowl, I've switched over to my high-speed steel cutting tool here. Since this tool is also designed for hollowing, you can extend it quite a ways past that tool rest, which makes it easier to work around from the foot of the bowl and kind of create this nice big sweeping arc that I'm looking for here on the outside of the bowl. Now that I like the shape of the bottom of the bowl, it's time to start working on the bead where that maple band is up near the rim. So I've just got my skew chisel out here, and I'm just making a little V-notch to try to get a nice clean cut as we kind of shave down or kind of pull down the walnut to expose that raised bead. Ultimately, I want that maple bead to extend about 1/4 inch off the side of the bowl. Here we're back with our cutter tool, just kind of feathering out that walnut surface just below the bead. And finally, we're just kind of rounding over the edges on that bead as we wrap up the outside of the bowl. Now that the exterior of the bowl is in good shape, it's time to turn our attention to the interior. Now, the one nice thing about segmented bowls is that we don't have nearly as much material on the inside that we need to turn away. Of course, most of the time when we're turning a log or something like that, unless we're using a coring operation, we're putting a lot of chips in the floor. So one of the nice things, especially when you're working with a more expensive wood like walnut, is here we're not wasting a lot of wood. It also doesn't take too long to hollow out the inside of a bowl. Now, the other thing you may notice here is I'm using the tailstock. So I've got a block right in the middle of the bowl that I've just got the tailstock pushed up there. And the reason I'm doing this, especially as I'm working out here on the rim, that's where I'm putting the most leverage on that recess that the chuck is holding on to. So I am using the tailstock as support for as much as possible as I'm working not only on the outside of the bowl, but also here on the inside of the bowl. So using the tailstock is going to affect what tools I use. So instead of using a bowl gouge for most of the hollowing, I am going to use that high-speed steel cutter tool, which I don't need nearly as much range of motion. I can work right here off the side of the bowl pretty easily, and you can also see I've got my kind of short 6-inch tool rest that I'm using to kind of make all this stuff fit in place. And just like most bowls that we're turning, I want to make sure that the thickness up here at the rim is right where I want it before I start working too far down into the bottom of the bowl. Now we've got the tailstock removed, and it's time to work down to the bottom of the bowl. So on the bottom of this bowl, not only do I want to work down that last ring down into the base, but I also want to scoop out the very bottom just a little bit. So I don't want that bottom, remember we made that perfectly flat earlier, I don't want to leave it that way. I want it to feel like that scooped out a little bit, and that the bottom of the bowl just kind of sweeps up into the sides, and I don't have that flat bottom that you can sometimes get with a segmented bowl. And before we start sanding, we're just going to take our negative rake scraper on both the outside and inside of the bowl and just try to refine the edge and kind of help start that refinement and finishing process. Okay, now it's time for everyone's favorite part, and that is sanding. So I am using my air-powered die grinder to power sand, and I'm starting out at 100 grit. kind of progressing through the grits up to 320. I do this both on the inside and outside of the bowl. One of the other nice things about doing segmented bowls and segmented turnings is the way the rings are constructed, you end up dealing with a lot less end grain, so there's a lot less tear out, so the sanding process really goes pretty quickly. This bowl is intended to be a solid bowl that I would expect to get a lot of use in a kitchen. With that in mind, the finish on this bowl is only shellac. We're going to use about 4 coats total, which will create a really great shine and offer a lot of protection. If you want to learn more about how I use shellac in the shop, check out this video linked above.